We had the pleasure of having Ann Van Dyke join us for the 2019 Synod of the Trinity Regional Connection for Partnership and Networking gatherings that were focusing on hate behavior and hate groups. Ann was a civil rights investigator and trainer for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission for close to 32 years. What follows is the PowerPoint that she presented at the regional meetings. One thing Ann wanted to discuss was the definitions of hate. Here you can see what her definitions of hate are. I'll let her take it from here.
Now, there are many definitions of hate. This is a particular psychological definition that I've always found to be really helpful. And that's because this definition makes it so clear that hate is not an act of strength. It's an act of fear and weakness. It's simply the inability to tolerate human difference.
And then the rock bed of hate is prejudice. And I think this definition of prejudice is really helpful. It's the belief that we know a great deal about somebody that we don't know. And we all find ourselves relying on stereotypes rather than getting to know people as individuals. Okay, so here's the kind of slide I would use when doing training with police or with municipal government, just so we're kind of get a sense of what it is we're talking about when we're referring to organized racial supremacist groups. Very loosely structured sometimes highly structured, and leaders often use a type of language that appeals to mainstream Americans. And I'm not going to read to you, you can read the rest. The bottom line is very important, and that is it's not illegal to hate. And it's not illegal to join or to form an organized hate group. That our freedom of beliefs and thoughts is protected under the First Amendment. And in many circumstances, our speech is protected under the First Amendment as well. Okay, which takes us to the Constitution. So the rough cut on the freedom of speech rights, and by the way, we have the strongest freedom of speech rights in the galaxy, I think. The rough cut goes like this, that speech, whether spoken or written, that is in the form of opinion tends to be protected. So that's why you can have organized hate groups knee-deep on the internet. That's why you find white supremacist groups speaking their beliefs on Capitol and county courthouse steps. So opinion tends to be protected. What is not protected is speech that, and this is the court's language, incites imminent lawless action. So we're a group to hand out a flyer that says, meet us at 6 o'clock tonight and we'll go burn down a synagogue. That speech is not protected. So, okay. So in so many circumstances, hate speech is protected. So what do? What in the world is the solution to hate speech? The solution to hate speech is speech. It's our speech. Goodness has freedom of speech rights too. But we tend to forget that or just not to want to be reminded of it, because when hate shows up, we would rather say, too many times we would rather say, oh, just ignore them and they will go away, which is such baloney. Goodness has freedom of speech rights too. And Christians are called to constantly be in that mode of speaking and affirming equality and nonviolence for all of God's children. Okay. Oh, now the first time I read this, it made my head spin. And this would have been in 1989 when my job became working with communities where organized hate groups were having an impact. And that is, it's so important we understand that organized hate groups are not the problem. They're a symptom. They're a symptom of a larger and a deeper problem. And that is the fears and the biases in the hearts of mainstream Americans off which they feed. See, they couldn't exist if they didn't sniff out our fears and biases and hook into them. They wouldn't have anybody to recruit if mainstream Americans were not full of our own prejudices and fears and suspicions about people we do not know. Okay, so when President Obama won the primary, there was a marked increase of hits on white supremacist websites. And then in the last couple years, we have again seen a real increase in white supremacist groups, and that's for a long list of reasons. And one is this very simple reason of the demographics of the entire nation are changing rapidly. And wherever you see a struggling economy, that creates very ripe fodder for organized hate groups to hook into and feed off of, because folks who are struggling economically are looking for someone to blame. Okay. Okay. This is a real important list that normal people like you all, people who haven't monitored hate groups for a living, tend not to be aware of this list. But this is the long list of groups of human beings that white supremacist hate groups target. Now, of course, the Jewish community and African Americans have always been way at the top of that hate list, but Muslims are way up there now too. And all people of color, any color, all religious minorities, all immigrants, no matter where they're from, any other country under the US, they are on the hate and the hit list. And of course, the lesbian and gay and bisexual and transgender community are very much on that list as well. Now this next one, people tend not to be aware of, but people with handicaps or disabilities, mental or physical disabilities, they too are on the hate list for organized hate groups. And strong women, they don't like uppity women. I got on that list a couple ways, but particularly that way. And people in mixed relationships, any kind of racial, ethnic, religious mixture in families or friendships. And this is another way I got on the list. During much of the time when I was working with communities dealing with hate groups, I had 2 foster children who were refugees from Vietnam, and I was raising my goddaughter who is African American. And so mixed families are also very much on the list. Okay. So the Southern Poverty Law Center is a non-governmental group that does a lot of really good work in helping communities know how to prevent and, when necessary, how to respond to acts of hate in their communities. And they provide this very helpful definition. So immutable characteristics is just a fancy way of saying how God made you. Okay. This is a real important list. And I talked about this list, for decades, really, when I was doing this work for the state. And invariably, whatever town I was in, they would get mad at me because they thought I made the list up to describe their town. I would hear, oh, you made this list up for Erie, or you made it up for York, or you made it up for Williamsport. No, this is the list of the characteristics of communities where hate groups are best able to take hold and where there's most likely to be hate incidents among everyday folks who live in that community. So the first characteristic is that fear of changing population and communities where there's a strong sense of insiders and outsiders. Now, the only reason I get to talk about this without being hit by lightning is because of where I grew up. I'm really a farmer from northern Pennsylvania. And I grew up in a valley where my family goes back at least 5 generations. And I grew up hearing, I think it was my Uncle Dave say, Our family has been in this valley since Jesus was in junior high. So we grew up with a real strong sense that we had dibs on that valley, that that valley belonged to us and we belonged to it. So when outsiders came into our valley, it was okay as long as they acted like us and thought like us and believed like us and of course looked like us, because if those outsiders came into our valley and stayed, they would be bringing in a problem. We tended to have no perception that the problem lived there in us, and just the presence of difference brought it to the surface. And I dealt with that type of perspective so many times when I was doing this work for the state. I remember once someone spray painted KKK and the N-word and other hate graffiti on the side of an elementary school over in the Poconos area. And I asked the superintendent what their demographics looked like in the school and had it changed recently. And he said, yes, for the first time we have 4 African-American little kids in the elementary school. And then he said, you know, we never had this problem until they moved here. So you see, he was blaming it on the presence of people of difference. Population change, of course, brings conflict. Any change brings conflict. But as people of faith, we are called to deal with conflict in healthy ways. So you see the rest of the list: the struggling economy and any existing problem in a community creates fodder for hate groups to hook into. For example, I worked with one community that had a toxic dump. My goodness, the cancer rates of dairy cows and people was just out of sight. And a Ku Klux Klan tuned into that and said, we are the environmentalist Ku Klux Klan, and we are here to protect the little man against this evil corporation. So they moved into town and forgot all about the environment. This third one is really important for church folks. By disconnection, I mean, we nice mainstream Americans have so many ways of politely separating ourselves from people of different backgrounds. We politely separate based on race and religion and national origin and sexual orientation and politics and economics. And what that means is when someone in another group gets harmed, we get to say, well, that's too bad, but we don't know those people, therefore we have no responsibility here. And I would see that, for example, when synagogues or mosques would be desecrated, and too many church folks would say, well, you know, that's too bad, we don't know them. And they would do nothing. The other type of disconnection, which is so very detrimental to the health of communities and of its nation, is when alienated young people who do not have a rock to hang on to, and the church does not reach out and tend to them. Well, guess who's reaching out to them? Guess who's tending to them? Organized white supremacist groups, neo-Nazi skinheads, Ku Klux Klan, Aryan Nation. They are looking for those alienated kids, and that's who they recruit and pull right in. Look around your communities for alienated young people who feel like they don't fit in and don't belong. They need to be our targets for loving attention. If we don't do it, someone else will reach them. The next characteristic is communities where community leaders fail to publicly talk about 2 things. Number 1 is we need to be talking regularly, to be teaching about the positives of becoming truly pluralistic communities. It doesn't matter where we live. We are going to become more diverse communities quickly and soon. I guess that means the same thing. The populations of wherever we live are changing, and it's going to continue to happen. So we need to talk about it. We need to talk about the positives of being diverse communities instead of just looking at it with fear and suspicion and avoidance. The other thing is we need to step up to the mic and name it and talk about it when acts of hatred happens in our community. Too often, well, let me give you another example. I remember another school superintendent. This was out in Western Pennsylvania when during the night, someone went through town and spray painted KKK and swastikas and the N-word on just about everything that was holding still. And the next morning, the superintendent stepped up to the mic and said, "We think it was just a prank done by some kids." Well, what that said to the kids was, we can do that here. It's not that big of a deal. And what it said to the targets of that hatred is, we're not valued here. They don't care about what happens to us. What he needed to say, and what we all need to say when an incident of hate happens in our communities, we need to step up to that mic and say, painfully but truly, we are appalled that this act of hatred has happened in our community. We are particularly disturbed because it may have been our youth who did it, and we will never remain silent in the face of hate. That statement makes a world of difference, and it's the kind of statement that people of faith make. And the last characteristic is the most dangerous and the most pervasive and the most tempting characteristic for us all to fall into, and that is silence. The silence of good people is the most dangerous thing going. Silence is the welcome mat for hate. Whether we are silent when some hate graffiti goes up in town or some KKK recruitment literature is distributed here and there, whether our silence then or whether it's our silence when a friend tells a bigoted joke at the water cooler, silence is the welcome mat for hate. Okay. Oh, this is such an important slide. And this is where we can see that, again, hate groups do not exist in a vacuum. Their foundation is the fears and the biases and the stereotypes of everyday folks. Now, I'm going to give you just a minute to read particularly that stuff at the base of the iceberg. The stuff above the waterline tends to be just about all that we tune into. And if that's all that we tune into, we can say, well, I don't have anything to do with that stuff, therefore I have no responsibility here. But we need to look below the waterline, the foundation of hate in America. We need to see ourselves there. And particularly as people of faith, we need to clean it out. Okay. Well, this again comes from the Southern Poverty Law Center. Every year they try to document where hate groups are headquartered or located throughout the country. Please do go to their website, Southern Poverty Law Center, and take a closer look at this map. Okay. This is the Pennsylvania map. Now, it doesn't look like there's 36 dots there, but they are. Now, here's the other thing we need to say about this map. Please do not think that the impact of hate groups is only where the dot is. When I first started doing this work in the late 80s, it mattered very much where the dots were. But it doesn't matter so much anymore because organized hate groups are knee-deep on the internet. So every place needs to be covered with a big dot. And anymore, that's how most of the recruitment of hate groups is done via the internet and via racist rock music. So here's the list, and please later go on the website which describes the groups that are in Pennsylvania. and then in West Virginia and Ohio. Okay, but please know that with these dots, these are just the ones. Okay, I'm sorry, Mike, I'm not telling you, but are you following me? I'm still on Ohio.
Yeah, I can see what you're doing. You're good.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm supposed to be telling Mike when I'm switching, and I keep forgetting to. So you can see Mike when I move.
Yes.
Okay, good. So folks, please know this is just what the Southern Poverty Law Center has been able to document, to absolutely prove that these groups are where the dots are. That doesn't mean that's all there is. And please keep in mind the internet. That's how recruitment is done now. Okay, Mike, I am moving to the Ku Klux Klan. And my friends, the reason it's so important for church groups to talk about this group is the Ku Klux Klan insists they are the only true Christians. They say they burn the cross to light the way for Jesus. They say that red dot in the middle of the cross there stands for the blood of Christ. Now, the Ku Klux Klan is to Christianity what ISIS is to Islam. They are both small, violent groups that have kidnapped a corner of the faith and have claimed to represent the whole thing. Okay, and you know, Klan is very active again. Okay, this is some relatively recent recruitment literature by a particular Clavern. There's many different ones in Pennsylvania. The American Knights of the KKK, the Invisible Empire, the Invincible Empire, the White Knights. There's a long list. Okay. Now, some of these slides that I'm going to give you a lot of bad news, but please know I am headed to good news. I really am headed to good news. It's just important that you get an idea of the variety of groups that are out there focusing on recruiting our alienated young people who don't have a rock to hang on to. Okay. Oh, this was taken recently from the Pennsylvania state capitol steps. This is, white supremacists come pretty regularly to the state capitol. And every time they do, we unite and organize what we call a unity event at exactly the same time on the other side of town to affirm equality and nonviolence. And we always get 3 to 4 times more people than they do, but they tend to get more press than we do. Okay. Oh, yeah, this is another group that's trying to be an umbrella group to organize all the white supremacists and allegedly working to create a whites-only state in the northwest corner of the country. Okay. Racist skinheads, we want to be able to ignore them, but we cannot. This is the group that knows how to recruit young people who are struggling. They're very good at it. And they're very good at providing the rationale to hate and to harm people that they don't know. Okay. You see a lot of this. I read a lot of tattoos. And I keep mentioning this. This is the website. So, Mike, you're following me?
Yep.
Okay. This is where it happens now. And you see that expression, armchair racists? These are people who don't go out and actually become a card-carrying member of an organized hate group, but they support them financially, and they support them with their beliefs, and they support them with their words. So when a Muslim family or a Latino family or whoever, a new family moves to their community, the armchair racists are the people that spread the rationale to hate and harm this new family. So this is an example of white supremacy on the internet. And you see down there those numbers, 670 websites, 2,500 portals. That was just the last time I counted. I'm sure it's much higher now, but you get the point. But there's another website that is now the most active. That one I just showed you, what's the name of it? Stormfront used to be the most active. Daily Stormer is now. And Daily Stormer, look at this bottom line. They are intentionally reaching out to a younger and wealthier group of people. Now you see that first bullet, that's how they bill themselves. That doesn't mean that's accurate. That's just how they are trying to present themselves as being more mainstream. Okay, now this slide is so important. We need to be very clear on how extremist groups, how cults or gangs or hate groups, how they recruit, how they pull in youth. First of all, they offer young people a sense of belonging, a sense of value, a sense of purpose and excitement. You know, our young people are looking for excitement. And this alignment with strong leaders, that charismatic leadership is a very strong pull. Also a sense of not feeling weak and alone, but feeling empowered and strong, and maybe for the first time in their life. And they get simple answers to complex problems. Hey, that's something we all really want. As we get older, we realize it usually doesn't exist. But for organized hate groups, that's very tempting. Like they'll say, the reason you flunked English is because your teacher's probably a Jew and she knows you're Aryan. That's a type of simple answers to complex problems I'm talking about. The reason your dad doesn't have a job is probably because some black guy took his job and the Jews are running the industry. That kind of stuff. And a lot of these kids come from abusive homes. That seems to be the common ground that we've learned with young people who get recruited, that they were abused at home. And so finally having protection is what really pulls them in. And then look for that last line, justification for violence. Now we can offer all this stuff, and just with an amendment to some of these, like a justification for nonviolence, and an understanding that complex problems don't have simple answers. There's so much we can offer that we have not been. Please also know that hate crimes are increasing markedly across the country. And hate crimes are a different legal category from organized hate groups. Hate groups are legally protected unless they do something illegal. Now, I want to move over to hate crimes. This is criminal acts motivated by hatred. For example, the burning of a church where it's an African-American congregation and the church was burned because it's an African-American church. That's a typical example of a hate crime. Or someone who is physically beaten up because they are wearing a yarmulke or a hijab, and they're beaten up for those reasons. So the FBI tells us that the majority of people who commit hate crimes all across this country are the group they call thrill seekers. And they are groups of teenage boys who are not members of a hate group, who are not members of a cult, but rather commit their crime for a social thrill and bragging rights among their peers. These are our young people that we have not reached, who believe that it's okay to hate and harm people who are of different backgrounds. Now, I just got the 5-minute warning and I need to get you to some good news. So I'm moving ahead. Okay, this doesn't look like good news, but it is. David Edwards was one of the defectors from white supremacist groups who left and who began to work on our side. Please read what he wrote to us. So David said to me, when you go out to do those presentations, please tell them if they want to cut the hate movement in half in a month, then double their drug and alcohol budgets for youth. So these are the 5 people I came to know well and work with, who used to be invested white supremacists who left the hate movement and came over to our side to make amends. And this is, you see what they taught us. Let me tell you quickly David's story. David's parents were both alcoholics. He was born and raised over in New Jersey. When he was in high school, he was not a racist, and he dearly loved his girlfriend, Jeanette. Jeanette was Native American, and she had brown skin, which is important to this story. When they graduated from high school, Jeanette went off to a private school up in New England, and David went into the military, where he became an alcoholic. He was given a general discharge, and he said this to me. He said, I memorized it. He said, I went back to my hometown and I knocked on the doors of churches because I was looking for God, but no one had time for a lost soul like me. Well, guess who had time for him? The Aryan nations and the arm of it called the Christian Identity Movement, which is this terrible, hateful reinterpretation of the Bible and of the message of Jesus. They've turned it into believing that, bear with me, that Jews are children of Satan and that people of color are not full human beings. So under the Christian Identity Movement, he was free to hate and harm everybody who wasn't white. So he became a very effective recruiter of alienated young white people, and that's when I ran into him, and he was good at his job. Then I lost track of him, and he apparently moved out of Pennsylvania. He called me a couple years later at the commission where I was working, and he said, do you remember me? And I said, oh yeah, how are you doing? And he told me he had called me to help him start his life over because he'd left the hate movement. And I said, why did you leave? And he said, I left because Jeanette tracked me down. She still has brown skin, and I realized I had been recruiting people to hate and harm her. And he said, instead, I started daydreaming about marrying Jeanette and moving into a little house with a picket fence and having children. All of these people you see here left the hate movement for the same reason. Love came into their lives some unexpected, unsolicited way and fed them more than hate ever had. In Floyd's case, it was because he had a little boy born with a cleft palate and then realized he'd been recruiting people to be willing to kill his son because his son was not a perfect Aryan specimen. Frank also was a neo-Nazi skinhead. He was in jail for a hate crime, and his girlfriend had his baby girl. And he looked at the picture of his little girl and thought, I don't want her to live the life I have. Plus, he was in a cell with an African-American young man. And don't you know, they became friends and realized they had a lot in common. With Angela's case, it was because people who she hated, African Americans and Jewish people, befriended her, even though they knew of her background. And she found that being respected and being trusted and being pulled in fed her more than the hate movement ever had. Love is always stronger, and we forget that. Okay. So this is something that I wrote particularly for churches. We need to get back this is not my issue, this is not my job. We are followers of Christ. Wherever people are judged or excluded, whether they are the Haitis, like the Muslims, the Jewish people, the African Americans, the Latinos, the immigrants, or whether they're the haters, those young kids getting sucked into the hate movement. It is our job to reach out to them. We can't get past that. And this, at the bottom of this slide, you'll see something we wrote for churches where, well, in this case, it was a Ku Klux Klan clavering was standing in front of the church where there was an all-white congregation handing out Klan literature. And we said to them, take their flyer, give them a bulletin, invite them to come in. They're not going to. They don't like to be outnumbered. And do not show intimidation. And also look around your community for people who are very much targeted by their hate and reach out to them. I moved on. For example, in communities where this has happened, there was a nearby AME church. Now that African American congregation, of course, was impacted much more strongly because Klan was in their neighborhood. So we need to reach out to all people of faith. We need to be partner congregations on an ongoing basis. We need to reach out and affirm our common ground as people of faith. And we need to be speaking regularly and not just waiting for a hate group to come in town, or not just waiting for one of our white young kids to get sucked into a hate group. You will, and I know you see the news and you see that there are hate rallies all over the place in Pennsylvania and across the country. Don't be silent on that day. Unite at another location. Always reach out to those who are targeted. And there are wonderful resources out there. Like you see this resource for teaching tolerance. Okay. And this is the ongoing work of people of faith. Look for those triggering conditions in your community. And see that bottom point, affirm equality and nonviolence as a spiritual matter. I do want them to see that very last page. Yep. With the website resources.
Got it.
Okay, I do want them to see that. And can folks get these resources another way?
Yes, they're actually on a web page I created.
Oh, wonderful.
All of those are on there.
Wonderful, thank you.